Awesome. So wonderful to meet you all. Again, my name is Neil and excited to talk to you about deep sea mining, which is one of the engagements that we are working on in terms of the advocacy and the science angle as Benioff Ocean Science Laboratory. Just to, yeah, definitely to answer some of the questions early on, like what is the perspective? It's definitely anti-deep sea mining that we come from. Tons of negative impacts to our marine ecosystems that a lot of us are working really hard to protect. So yeah, just definitely not coming here from a pro mining standpoint. So just a little overview of how we're going to approach today and what we'll talk about. First, I'll just describe what is deep sea mining. What is the activity? What are people hoping to mine for? Where are they hoping to mine for? And why? And also how it happens. Then we'll go a little bit into the potential impacts of deep sea mining, what the side effects of an industry like might be on the ecosystems, on broader marine health, and on climate. And then dig into a little bit of what I forget the name, is curious about in terms of, this international negotiations and the current landscape of what is happening with deep sea mining right now in the high seas, what is happening in terms of a moratorium, what can we expect this next month? And then lastly, answering those questions that's on everyone's mind, that, like, is it necessary to fund this green transition and to reach these net zero by 2050 goals? So we'll dig into that and we'll look into, why, or particularly why it's not necessary, and what some of these alternatives may be. So at a high level, here's a graphic that just sort of visualizes what deep sea mining might be, but it is exactly what it sounds like, which is the exploration and the extraction of critical minerals found on the seabed. A lot of times this is just going to be very akin to terrestrial mining, taking really big machines that are excavating the sediment, they're digging up and they're extracting metals and utilizing them for other resources. So here's just a list of some of the most common metals and elements that are found in the seabed and are of commercial interest. This is what people are finding in certain areas around the world, but we're going to focus specifically on the top four, which is cobalt, copper, manganese, and nickel. You can think of these like the big four of the metals as it relates to electronics, to batteries, and to the green transition. So these four metals are pretty essential for battery technology. The phone that's in all of your pockets, what you're watching the webinar on. And then the most contentious and the most relevant into the discussions are electric vehicles. All of these, to date, the vast majority of these devices utilize these four metals through lithium ion battery chemistries. And yeah, Barbara, as you mentioned, one of the major routes that people are talking about to achieve these net zero goals is fully electrifying our vehicle fleets, turning all of our gas guzzlers into electric cars. And that's obviously going to require a lot of batteries and a lot of these types of metals. So that's why people are really interested in mining the deep sea. That's also why you get this greenwashing tone on deep sea mining that, like, oh, it's necessary to prevent climate change. I'll dig into this a little bit later after I talk about deep sea mining, but at a high level, I personally don't know if fully replacing every single vehicle on the road with a brand new electric vehicle is the climate smart way forward and is what's necessary, particularly if we haven't even addressed what our electricity infrastructure is. If you're going to be charging your Tesla in the Midwest, where all of your electricity is being produced by fossil fuels and natural gas and oil, then it's really not solving the issue of what the origin of the energy is and the emissions at hand. But we'll dig into that a bit later. So there are three main resource types that people are interested in mining within the deep sea. And these are polymetallic nodule fields, hydrothermal vents, and seamounts. And we'll dive into these individually a bit. I'd say polymetallic nodules are the star of the show. That is what most people, most of the companies, most of the countries are focused on. And these are basically fist-sized rocks that you could fit in your hand, littering this floor, these areas called abyssal plains, which are very, very large, very wide, open, and flat areas, plains on the seafloor. And these pictures you can see on the right demonstrate they're just like nodules, these fist-sized rocks absolutely covering these fields. And they have been found to contain significant amounts of manganese, around 30% manganese, and then trace amounts, but still commercially viable or commercially interesting amounts of cobalt, nickel, and copper. So that is literally the big four elements all captured within this one rock, and is also why some of these some people are calling polymetallic nodules batteries in a rock. Like they're literally being called batteries in a rock because they have those four metals. It's really interesting. They form over millions and millions of years. These are not a renewable resource by any means. They basically, the dissolved metals in the seawater at the seafloor precipitates over something small, a fragment of a shell, a piece of a bone, or a fish bone or something down there. And over literally millions of years, the metals just slowly precipitate out and have formed these rocks you see on these pictures. The average growth rate of these rocks is 1 to 3 millimeters per million years. So what you see here, fist-sized rock would have taken many, many, many millions of years to form. If we harvest that, we're obviously not going to see the return of these rocks in any time that makes sense for organic timescales or for human timescales. Definitely can't be sustainably or renewably mined. The next resource that people are interested in are hydrothermal vents. They're also called polymetallic sulfides or C4 massive sulfides. And these are super rich in copper and zinc, and sometimes gold and silver. So very different types of metals that they'd be searching for than the polymetallic nodules, but still pretty commercially interesting. Some studies actually claim that the origin of life on planet Earth actually stemmed from these hydrothermal vents. And that can be traced all the way back to some of these extremophiles, these water bears that you may have heard from or heard of, all living in this really extreme environment. And so what these hydrothermal vents are is basically you can imagine two oceanic plates moving apart, like separating at a divergent boundary. And then that seawater will seep into those cracks. And then the magma, the molten rock that's underneath the crust, actually heats up that water. It superheats it, sometimes as high as 752 degrees Fahrenheit. Very, very hot, but it doesn't actually boil because of the immense pressure that is experienced at that depth. So all of the water up top, lots of pressure, not causing it to boil. But then the sort of like chimney-like things and the smokestacks that you see in these three pictures, these are the sulfides that are forming. And so dissolved metals that are in the water, same as the polymetallic nodules, they actually precipitate out once the superheated water meets the near freezing surrounded water. So that temperature differential causes those to precipitate, and then slowly they're building up in sort of these spire-like, chimney-like patterns. So these actually form a lot more quickly than the polymetallic nodules. Still not very, very fast, but they are quicker. But there's not many active vent zones. Active meaning that they're actually still currently heating. There's only around estimated 50 square kilometers of total area of active hydrothermal vent zones within our oceans. And there's definitely plenty of more inactive ones, and both active and inactive are being sought after for mining. And then the last resource that is in the discussion and that people are curious about is cobalt-rich ferromanganese crusts. You might also hear these referred to as seamounts or underwater mountains. And the metals that we're interested in here are cobalt, clearly, manganese, and nickel. So again, those ones that are very, very relevant towards batteries. The picture on the left is just what a seamount might actually look like, but on the one on the right actually shows a graphic of how these form. So seamounts are essentially like big stirring rods in the water, and you have currents moving around them. And so the mount is actually producing very large eddies, which causes nutrients to sort of, come in place, come much closer to this mount, and that includes the metallic compounds. And so a lot of times these metallic compounds end up depositing on that rock, and we pretty much see the richest deposits on the upper slopes, the upper steepest slopes of the seamount. And that's because the metal can't actually deposit onto a rock that's covered in sediment. They can only deposit straight onto the rock itself. So the upper slopes is where we have rock that's exposed because all the sediment has sort of fallen down to the lower slopes. So people are targeting these really small or specific areas on these seamounts, which are very rich in cobalt, manganese, and nickel. Again, these precipitate pretty similarly to polymetallic nodules, even slower actually. So sometimes an average growth rate of like 1 millimeter per million years. So again, if we're looking to harvest those aren't going to come back anytime soon. Very much so not a renewable resource. And I'll just show you this map is a good way to sort of visualize where are we going to be finding these resources. It's a global map, and you can sort of see where the nodules are, the vents are, the crests are. And I also want to point out the exclusive economic zones, and we'll touch upon this in a bit, but most of these resources are outside of those white boundaries, which represent the EEZ of a country or the radius in which they're able to operate, where they're able to manage their waters. It's, you know, their territorial waters. All of these resources are outside of that, meaning they're in international waters or high seas, very notoriously difficult to manage because, you know, it technically belongs to no one. It requires a lot of international cooperation. We'll dig into that a little bit later, but I wanted to flag that. We'll talk about that when we discuss the international negotiations. But first, I just wanted to show you this video. It's like a little animation of seabed mining. And so there's 3 resource types we talked about, but we're going to sort of focus in on one for the rest of this presentation, and that's the polymetallic nodule fields. Those are basically the center of the discussion, and so the center of where everybody's interested in. So as you're watching this animation, it demonstrates how mining a nodule fuel would actually happen. There's a surface vessel, and they're lowering down this thing that I could only describe as a glorified vacuum cleaner, essentially. They're dropping it down all the way to the seafloor. These abyssal plains exist at depths of 3,500 meters to 6,000 meters. And yeah, so when they hit the floor, they're basically going to turn on and start vacuuming like a Hoover, moving pretty slowly in back and forth transects over these fields, using some sort of size related filter to suck up the nodules. As you can see, what's being visualized is a very, very large sediment plume. If you are familiar with agriculture, industrial agriculture at all, you know about tilling or sowing seeds, you know, big machines going through, ripping up the sediment, ripping up the soil. Here, that's going to cause a lot of plumes because it's underwater. That sediment is going to float. That sediment is going to travel. And so that's one of the reasons why it's going to damage super large ecosystems. We'll talk about that later in impacts, but now you're visualizing or you're seeing the nodule is actually being lifted up this riser pipe. So once it gets vacuumed up, it's going to be sucked up this pipe all the way to the surface vessel. Obviously, sediment is coming along with it. And as the nodules are moving up, they're hitting against each other. They're fragmenting, you know, small pieces of metal shards, small pieces of this rock are going to be coming off. Then they're processed on the surface vessel. So they're going to take, you know, what rocks they're interested in, take it to land. And then the rest of that is called the discharge. It's the waste sediment, and they are planning on discharging that at depth. So not at the bottom of the seafloor where it was harvested, which in theory would be the most environmentally friendly way to do something that's inherently environmentally friendly, but they're doing it at this mesopelagic depth, which is around 300 to 1,200 meters in depth. And so that's, you know, that sediment's going to be discharged in the ocean and lead to several impacts. So we'll get into a little bit of these impacts here, but I'll just sort of provide an overview. Ones we're already pretty aware of: biodiversity lost, incredible deep sea biodiversity down there. Long-term carbon cycle disruptions, and that's one that, you know, this is touted as a climate change solution, but the deep ocean is the planet's biggest carbon sink. You know, the ocean absorbs I think somewhat of a 75% of the carbon in our atmosphere, and then all of that actually eventually gets long-term stored in deep sediments. We don't know what digging that up is going to do to the carbon. We don't know if that carbon is released, how it might interact with long-term other geochemical cycles, or if it's going to be released to the atmosphere again. So again, like, even though it's touted as a climate change solution, it could very much so have negative consequences for our carbon levels. And then also disruption of marine ecosystems, wildlife populations, and we'll also touch on some cultural heritage impacts. So to discuss these impacts, I'm going to use this graphic you see on the left to sort of describe it. It's a really good graphic that shows where these plumes are happening and what they're impacting. So we'll start with that collector plume at the bottom. There's going to be very, very, very large amounts of sediment. They're going to be disturbed by a vacuum cleaner, basically going over these abyssal plains. And models as well as experiments have found that this sediment can actually drift hundreds of kilometers, I think upwards of 200 kilometers from the site. So not only are you going to smother and destroy whatever ecosystem you're already on, but say there's an ecosystem next door that's actually been protected from mining, because that's actually what's happening with these international negotiations. They have areas that are protected for environmental reasons. Next door is a mining claim area, so that area is not necessarily protected, as that sediment can drift over there up to 100 to 200 kilometers away and then smother whatever life is on there, cover it in a layer of dust, preventing oxygen exchange, generally just destroying what life is there, even if the mining isn't happening at that area. The photo in the bottom left actually shows a picture taken of an experimental mining simulation that was done 37 years beforehand. So they didn't do any mining, but they had simulations of similar machines moving along, creating tracks. This picture was taken 37 years later. You can see the tracks are literally still there. No signs of life have returned. Very, very, very little ecosystem recovery. Hearing that these ecosystems take millions of years to develop, it seems pretty obvious that they wouldn't have recovered, but sometimes still got to show it. And yeah, so not just sort of deep sea sponges and anemones and corals that actually physically attach to these nodules, but then you have really charismatic species like the Dumbo octopus, which is called the Dumbo octopus because it has these cute little like big elephant ears almost, and that lives on nodule fields as well, and it actually is feeding on some of these sea corals, sea sponges, and anemones that call nodules home. Another type of impact is going to be noise and light pollution, just as there is with, oil rig mining in the ocean or anything like that. There's going to be a lot of noise from it, huge amounts of noise. There's going to be a lot of light. We have tons of marine mammals migrations like whales that are passing through these areas, and also fisheries, fisheries that are countries heavily dependent on fisheries for their livelihoods. These types of establishments could potentially cause them to move and lead to behavior changes that will lead to that. And I'll just sort of touching on that picture at the bottom again. The current mining operations that are expected would be expected, or that have claim areas, are expected to strip mine roughly 8,000 to 9,000 square kilometers of seabed over the course of their 30-year contract. So that's just sort of giving you a scale of, it might look small on a map of the globe, but it's actually quite a large area that these miners would be tearing up. And also then show a few other impacts. And this is now, we talked about the collector plume. Now I want to talk about the surface plume or the discharge plume. Tons of environmental impacts that expand beyond the deep sea here. And that's a lot of what for example, my work in terms of stakeholder engagement has been dealing with, is not necessarily like, engaging and educating about what biodiversity is down in the deep sea, but actually how this activity is going to impact other industries, other people, and other broader marine ecosystems. So we have sediment that's being discharged. That's going to lead to reduced oxygen levels, going to lead to reduced amount of fish, and especially forage fish. You also have reduced sunlight if it's being discharged at the surface, potentially resulting in reduced primary productivity. Specifically, I want to refer to this DSL change. DSL relates or it means deep scattering layer. And that's actually an area of the water column that has a super, super high biomass of marine organisms, a lot of which are fish. This is sort of where the majority of life at sea, life at the open ocean, is expected to exist in this like one sort of layer in the ocean. A lot of fish are congregating. it's sometimes so dense that when boats that are doing bathymetry studies, they're using sonar to send sonic signals down and receive the signal back so they can map the seafloor in the bathymetry, we sometimes get false bottoms because it's actually hitting this layer of fish and this layer of organisms they're so densely packed that they're reflecting the sonar back up, and it looks like, oh, it's weird that the seafloor is right there. It's actually just a lot of fish. As you can imagine, that's incredibly important to things like marine mammals that are diving down there to feed, and also fisheries. So we've got lots of, I don't know if a lot of you eat seafood, but if you like species like tuna, or billfish, those are going to be diving down from the surface, feeding in these column areas, and going back up. So if we have sediment going there, that's going to smother their forage base. One, that could result in lower productivity for the fishery, less fish being able to survive because of less food. Another really important impact that I want to talk about as it relates to fisheries is also toxicity. So again, if you eat tuna, you've probably heard the fact that you shouldn't eat tuna more than once a week or more than a few times a month because of the mercury levels, and that's because of bioaccumulation. So if there's mercury in the water, something very low on the seafood chain is going to have little bits of it. As you move up the chain, the seafood, you're actually multiplying that amount of toxin by an order of magnitude. So the next fish is going to have 10 times that amount of mercury. And then once you reach an apex predator like a bluefin tuna, you have thousands of times of that heavy metal concentration in the tuna. So any apex predator you're eating in the sea is going to have this problem. The problem we foresee with deep sea mining is that we're mining metals. We showed you that depiction of those nodules moving up a riser pipe. They're fragmenting. They're chopping themselves up. Metals are going into that sediment, and it's going to be discharged. Preliminary studies have actually looked at the metal concentrations in the collector plume. So not even from sucking it all the way up and processing it, but just from moving some nodules on the floor into a pile elsewhere. They found, prelim data hasn't been published, but what they did find is a 40-fold increase in the toxic heavy metals concentration in that water. So you can only imagine that if it's actually brought upwards to the floor and then discharged, that it's actually potentially going to be significantly higher than 40 times concentration of average levels. And so if we discharge that in the mesopelagic zone, in that DSL layer where all the fish is, you are going to have major implications for contamination of seafood, and increased toxicity and bioaccumulation of all these metals that we're mining for in things like tuna. Really bad, not only for our health and for populations that actually rely on seafood and fisheries for their nutrition, but also for their livelihoods and their economy. And if the consumers in global north countries and developed countries don't be like, oh, I'm going to eat less seafood now, also potentially bad for sort of economic livelihoods there. So those are just a few of the major impacts that we can expect to see. And lastly, I want to show you the scale of these sediment plumes and the scale of this impact, which you can look at this here on the right-hand side. So it's specifically referring to the CCZ, the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, which is the area most of interest for mining right now. And if they mine 500,000 square kilometers, we are expected to see an impact on just the seafloor of 3 times that much. So 1.5 million square kilometers, equal to the size of 300 times the Grand Canyon. If you then actually look at how that's going to impact the whole water column, given the discharge depth, the upper level is the surface, that ends up being 3 times the volume of the Himalayan mountain range. So it's like an insanely large amount of impact of our ocean ecosystems from just this one area that people want to mine in the high seas. So just want to keep that in your mind. And lastly, just to show you what actually happens in practice. So that graphic said, oh, we're going to bring the nodules up from the ground and then we're going to discharge them at depth. We're not going to discharge them at the surface, because everybody knows discharging stuff at the surface is bad. But the metals company, the biggest sort of company that's actually developing this technology, they're trying to get all the leases and the licenses, they're the ones doing it. They recently did a test of their technology in that area, the Clarion-Clipperton Zone in the Pacific, and they actually took up 3,600 tons of nodules. And what did the scientists record anonymously happening? Them dumping this bilge that you see right here off the side of their boat into the surface water. You can see the sediment plume. It's not being discharged at depth like they said they would. They're just straight up dumping it over the side. You can see how much it's spreading already in just, a few minutes. Of course, they got called out for it by Greenpeace. This is actually a Greenpeace video. And what do they say? Like, oh, like what's a test? Like we can't get everything right in the test. But just to show that, if there's not good transparency into this industry, we are going to see stuff like this happening where they're not doing it according to the book, which isn't, sustainable in itself, but they're going to be doing things like dumping their bilge at the surface, which is going to have even broader impacts for marine life. And lastly, I want to touch on cultural heritage. Definitely needs to be included in terms of the impacts that we can expect. Lots of peoples of the ocean, people that have cultures, small Pacific islands, etc., indigenous communities, they are deeply, deeply connected to the ocean. The ocean is their identity. It's a direct foundation of their livelihoods, often through fishing, but then their origin and their cultural heritage. There's, I'm showing this, the Kumulipo specifically, it's the Hawaiian creation chant, or the Hawaiian origin story. And it actually describes how the origin of life stems from a single coral polyp. That's a sacred animal to them, that all life stemmed from this coral polyp. And based on the language and based on science as well, this is likely referencing a deep sea coral. Deep sea coral are actually the oldest living animals on planet Earth. Some deep sea corals today that are alive are upwards of 5,000 years old. So not only do we have all these impacts to our ecosystems, to biodiversity, biophysical impacts, carbon, but it's going to be a huge insult on peoples of the Pacific and people who, have grown up and have evolved, co-evolved with the ocean and have these really deep connections there. And so luckily, we're also working with a ton of indigenous leaders from Hawaii, from other Pacific islands who are getting really involved in these international negotiations because, the indigenous voice really does matter and really has makes waves in these negotiations. So we're really glad to be working with them. Now I just want to bring back this slide to discuss again, like where is this set to happen? And as we mentioned, none of the vast majority of these resources are in the high seas. They're in the areas called international waters. No country has jurisdiction over it. No country is able to single-handedly manage that or extract from it. And so resources in the high seas have often been called the common heritage of mankind, which is actually a core tenet of international law. And so this principle basically says that, anything beyond these territorial areas should be held in trust for future generations and be protected from exploitation by any individual nation or corporation. And that was sort of actually, that was decided and said by the Maltese ambassador to the UN, Arvid Pardo, all the way back in 1967, where he proposed this in a speech, this idea, specifically as it relates to the seabed and the ocean floor beyond national jurisdiction. And so later that speech laid the groundwork for what some of you may have heard of called UNCLOS, or the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which is a really big international treaty about, how do we manage the international waters? How do we manage high seas? And it's now the founding basis for a lot of the international treaties that have come out since then, and maritime regulations around fishing, around everything else. And so what that also led to is the creation of the International Seabed Authority. This is the UN governmental body that is responsible for basically managing these high seas resources, managing the international seabed and the minerals, and how leases are going to be granted, how mining is going to be granted, or how regulations are going to be established. So it's a UN body. It's made up of a bunch of member states that are UN countries, as well as some observer states who are, not party to it, but are participating. The best example would be the US, which is notoriously hasn't ratified the Paris Climate Accord, hasn't ratified the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, but they still participate in these discussions as observers. And, given their economic influence, definitely still make waves and still pretty influential in these discussions. So all of the decisions about, are we going to mine the high seas? How are we going to do it? What are the regulations? That happens in Kingston, Jamaica, which is where the ISA regularly convenes. They're basically supposed to do two things. They're, from their language of their creation, they were tasked with two things. One is to protect the marine environment, and two, the deep sea and the marine environment. And two is to grant leases and contracts for seabed mining in the high seas while establishing adequate regulations. So obviously those things can't really go hand in hand, and they are not going hand in hand in reality. So the sad reality of the situation is that the ISA, although they are tasked with protecting the marine environment, they are actually a pro-mining organization. So that's where everything is happening, but the ISA is literally pro-mining. People who are in their secretariat that run it want mining to go forward. So unfortunately for people like us, for countries that are against it, people that want to protect the seabed, it is a little bit like fighting an uphill battle. The ISA has been notorious in preventing scientists from trying to speak as much as they want to at these things. They've been preventing certain industries and stakeholders from having a voice. They have all these restrictions, and sometimes small island developing states that are going to be most impacted by mining aren't even able to get there, aren't even able to represent themselves there because, costs and all sorts of things. So it's pretty messed up that's how this is being managed, but definitely the work still moves on. So I'll just show you these 4 pictures of, these are the leases that have actually already been granted by the ISA. I'll be clear, no leases for exploitation or extraction have been granted yet. All of these are for exploration. Definitely still an indicator of what's likely to happen, or if a license is applied for exploitation, it would happen in the exploration claim area. But just to show you, there's 31 contracts in total, 21 contractors, and these are 15-year contracts. And just to be also to show, 18 of those 31 contracts are held by just 7 countries. So the major players in this whole thing are China, France, Germany, India, Japan, South Korea, Russia. And if you're looking at these 4 lease areas, which are spanning like the world where people are looking at resources, it's probably pretty obvious that one of them is much more busy than the other. And so, yes, 17 of the 31 contracts are in one specific area called the Clarion-Clipperton Zone. That is the one I mentioned earlier, and you can see it here. It is basically an area that's around the size to span the continental United States, between Hawaii and Mexico. So Eastern Pacific, definitely like semi-close to our backyards as divers on California coast. But yeah, this is the high seas area of greatest interest. The resource that's down there, polymetallic nodules on abyssal plains. This is where mining is most likely to happen. This is where much of the deep sea mining exploration and tests have already occurred. And this is where we expect applications, the first applications to mine, to be. So the CCZ or the Clarion-Clipperton Zone. Sorry, let me take a sip. And now this is just a timeline to show what has happened recently in these international negotiations and what are we expecting to come up. And I want to center it around one very contentious event, which is visualized in the top right there. A small island Pacific state, Nauru, exactly almost 2 years ago, like literally to the date, in 4 days, it will be 2 years ago, implemented something known as the 2-year rule. So this is part of the law. It's part of the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea and the ISA's creation that says, if a country implements this rule, then exactly 2 years later, the ISA then has exactly 2 years to establish regulations to mine by that 2 years. And if not, then they're able to submit an application to mine under whatever regulations are in place at the time. Definitely a lot of controversy around this rule. Why was it there in the first place? And also the legal implications of, if they're submitting an application, does the ISA still have to consider it, or do they still have to grant it? All of those things are undetermined, and we will actually be finding out very soon. You see that says July 2023, which is literally right now. The next ISA meeting in Kingston is happening next week, and it spans for 2 weeks. And this is very much so going to be the clear topic of conversation amongst everyone is, how do we address the 2-year rule? And also, the ISA is pretty secretive about what's their inner workings. We don't actually know if Nauru or another country applies for a license to mine. We don't know if they're going to do. 100% possible that if they do not grant that license and they're like, oh, we're not going to do this until regulations are in place, that's totally a possibility and under their legal rights. But it is equally under their legal rights to grant that license to mine. Hence why the biggest move forward is for, finding a moratorium, which we'll also touch on a little bit more in a second. I just want to also note that it says, Nauru and the metals company, it's not just Nauru. It's heavily influenced by these private sector interests. So this is Gerard Barron, who is the CEO of the metals company, which is a private Canadian company that is planning on, they're the center of the deep sea mining conversation. They're the ones that are really involved in the negotiations, and they're the ones that really want to mine, and they're searching for investors and money. To be frank, what they're doing is they're using small, developing, economically challenged states as pawns, in their whole scheme to profit off of the common heritage of mankind. A company can't apply for a license. It has to be a country because, it's a UN, it's an international thing. It has to be a member state. And so what the metals company and, other big companies have been doing is trying to find really, easy targets, desperate countries or countries that just are struggling economically and presenting this as an opportunity for them to bolster their economy and saying, hey, partner with me, put in an application. Then I, Gerard Barron and TMC can mine this area and you can get some sorts of, a large amount of these profits. Is that really what's going to happen? Or is, the big company going to actually screw over the small state and how much of that profit are they going to see? All of these things are big questions, but I just wanted to point out that's why it's very being heavily driven by industry, and the countries that are sort of at this, the countries that are at the center are sort of being manipulated. Rather than looking at Nauru as a bad guy, I would be looking at them as, they are somewhat being manipulated by these big companies. So it's not all bad news. There is definitely momentum building towards a moratorium. It started back in 2022 when these other small Pacific states, led by Palau and Samoa and Fiji, came out, as an alliance to say, let us move towards a moratorium. And for anyone that isn't aware, a moratorium means a pause on the activity. So basically, we're going to not do deep sea mining until either a certain amount of time, like 10 years or something like that, or until adequate regulations are in place. So a lot of these positions, they're not saying don't ever do deep sea mining. What they're actually saying is let's not do deep sea mining until we have a much better understanding of the science, of the impact the activity is going to have on how that's going to be affected. And so 15 countries to date have now done that. And I want to point out France specifically being the first country to come forward with an outright ban. So they actually said that deep sea mining should be banned, not actually a moratorium, and not only in their waters, but also calling for that to happen in international waters. So that's definitely cream of the crop in terms of the ambition of these things. But the moratorium is definitely what all of us in the sort of NGO and the science community are trying to move towards. It's not just countries, it's also businesses. And so there's a statement that was pulled together by World Wildlife Fund. They've sort of coordinated it, but it's an industry-led statement. And you can see this huge names: Google, Samsung, Philips, all of them in the electronics. And then if you look at the auto sector, you got Volkswagen, Volvo, Renault, Rivian. So these are companies that are coming out not only saying, we want a moratorium on deep sea mining, but this is actually a statement with teeth behind it. So all of these companies said that their statement basically says that we will not provide or source any deep sea minerals, any critical minerals from the deep sea. We promise to never integrate anything like that in our whole supply chain, and to not fund or support any businesses that actually do deep sea mining. So this is it's a good statement. It's not just greenwashing. It's these companies are actually committed to not engaging in deep sea mining at all. And lastly, I'll just, maybe I'll skip over this slide, but scientists, 770 scientists are calling for it. Fisheries and seafood sectors are calling for it, and people as well, just the general public. And if you're looking for a call to action, or, how can I help as an individual? This thing down at the bottom right, is the Oceana's letter, and only one's letter. And you can sign that, and it's almost at 300,000 signatures, and those get presented at these big international negotiations. People are seeing this, and those are numbers are making waves. So lastly, I just want to talk about the alternatives, right? It's like the biggest question that's on everyone's mind. Is it necessary to mine the deep sea? Like, sure, we might harm some super beautiful and rare ecosystems and species, but climate change is on our doorstep. And, like, is that the bigger concern? That's definitely the question I also struggled with when I first started working on this issue. I came from a background in climate science. I've worked for the previous 2 years before Benioff on climate related science and policy. So it still is today, to me, the biggest challenge we face and one of the issues I care about most. But the answer is no. It is not necessary at all to meet goals for net zero by 2050. It is not necessary for the green transition, and research proves that. First, circular economy. That's something we should constantly always be focusing on. That's basically reducing demand, increasing the lifetime of our batteries, increasing the lifetime of these devices in our rotation, and also recycling, investing in recycling infrastructure. If you look at like this next slide, this little on the blue side, globally, 3 million electric cars worth of cobalt is just lost, is just straight up thrown away, or not salvaged, but is completely lost out of the supply chain because we haven't invested in recycling infrastructure. Deep sea mining is a super expensive activity. Imagine how difficult it would be to do something like that. It's super difficult to even do research down there, which is why we're in the predicament of not knowing enough about the science before the activity is happening, because it's really hard to fund. So obviously places like the metals company are going to need a lot of money, a lot of investments. Funnily enough, they've actually been delisted from the NASDAQ stock exchange twice. They're currently trading at less than $1 because they can't really, I think the momentum towards a moratorium is kind of having an effect on investors, and investors are like, is this actually something necessary? So the metals company is starting to look for domestic funding and, government funding. But yeah, if we invest all that money instead into recycling infrastructure, we can actually meet a lot of that demand, and reports have shown that. Another thing is shifting battery technologies. So right now, all these batteries, the reason they need nickel, cobalt, and manganese is because they're using a lithium ion chemistry. Yes, that chemistry is the most efficient and like longest lasting for something like an electric vehicle today, but there is an alternative called LFP, or lithium iron phosphates. These don't use any of these super rare earth metals. They use very easily and able to find things like iron, and they actually work incredibly well. They're a lot safer. They have less risk of blowing up. And the only downfall is that they last less long. Like if you have an electric car, it's not gonna, maybe the range is a little bit shorter. And so companies are sort of wary of reducing the range, but people are already figuring out solutions to that. 40% of China's electric fleet actually already uses LFP batteries, and Tesla, a significant amount of their Model S's or their Model M's, I forget what it is, those use LFPs as well. So they're already making their way into the supply chain, and they're figuring out how to, address the lifespan or the range issue by just fitting more of those batteries into the volume. So they are adjusting those. We continue to invest energy in there. We can maybe reduce the projected demand for the net zero goals by a lot. Public transit, like, do we really need to absolutely like create a brand new fleet of electric vehicles, or should we invest more money into sustainable, high quality public transportation that then reduces everyone's need to have an individual car? That's something I'm thinking about. And lastly, it's responsible land mining. Obviously, there's a lot of things wrong with terrestrial mining as is, a lot of ethical concerns, a lot of environmental concerns, but that's not to say that they can't be mitigated and that they haven't been mitigated in some senses. Terrestrial mining requires a significantly smaller footprint for the same mineral quantity as deep seabed mining, right? You're going deep into the earth, you have the whole like crust to deal with, versus deep sea mining, you're just like sucking off these, polymetallic nodules in a much larger area. There are ways to make it more sustainable, and even fallow mines, mines that have already been mined, people leave them there fully degraded, nothing's happening to them, but they have tons of minerals still left in them, and people just didn't think it was worth, the time and the energy to actually extract those, because it's slightly harder to extract minerals from the tailings. we invest more energy in, getting the full amount of minerals out of those already mines that have already degraded the land, they're already there. That's another way we can meet the demand. If you want to check out this WWF report, The Future is Circular, or this European Academy of Science Academy's statement on deep sea mining, both of them have actually produced research. If you're curious about the numbers, right? Like, is it actually necessary? They have the citations, they have the data, they have the research to prove that we can actually meet all of that demand for net zero by 2050 through other ways for, similar costs and similar investments. Lastly, yeah, I mentioned these ways that you can, if you wanted to get involved, you can fill out that only one platform, or you can actually go to this Defend the Deep website, which helps you. It's automatically designed to find your minister and craft a letter for you to the specific minister that would receive the letter. And so you can just basically press a few buttons and automatically it sends a full letter to the person who's going to be most relevant to you about deep sea mining. So these are just ways that we can continue to push the needle from the public's point of view, if you're curious. Now, lastly, I kind of want to leave on this parting message that's talking about the precautionary principle. This is like a funny little cartoon that describes the situation as a whole, but it's really true that, it's super clear humans have often gone forward with really extractive and harmful industries without asking enough questions. We have a do first, ask questions later mentality with oil, with anything, deal with the consequences rather than mitigate them up front. We are right now in a really, really rare situation that we're watching a brand new industry emerge. And it's really an opportunity for us as a society to just show that, hey, we have learned from these mistakes. We've learned from the mistakes that are leading to the destruction of our planet and climate change. And we're going to not make the same mistakes again. And we're going to make sure to do our due diligence. We're going to make sure we have a clear understanding of the impacts and the science before we get, in too deep. So that's known as the precautionary principle. That's really just the core of the whole messaging behind a moratorium, the whole core of why we shouldn't go forward with deep sea mining without knowing enough. Because it really, if we damage a million-year-old ecosystem, it's going to be impossible to repair once we learn what damage we've done. So that's just the parting message I want to leave with you all. There were some references, but yeah, thanks for listening. And I know we're a little bit over, but if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer some.
Neil, amazing. Really good presentation. I want to open it up for questions. Just come off mute. Feel free to jump in. One question that came up for me is if it's so expensive to go deep in the ocean, is it that it's so much more mineral rich? I mean, yeah, is that the ultimate thing? That's why they're doing it?
Oh, sorry, I couldn't find my unmute. Yeah, that is why they would be doing that. It's just it's a very, if you actually have the infrastructure, right? Say the metals company then designs this thing, there is the density of those minerals is just pretty easy to acquire and pretty easy to harvest in a sense. Obviously there's still a lot of technological challenges and they're not even able to fund themselves, but that is sort of the idea, and that it is just a bountiful resource for people to think about. Another thing to actually note also is the energy independence issue. And so that speaks to sort of domestic policy, right? We actually get the vast majority of our cobalt and our nickel and stuff like that from China. And the big issue in the US that we need to be independent for our energy production. We need to be independent for our critical mineral supply. So something like this would actually allow the US to say hey, we sourced our critical minerals from home instead of relying on China for things which have security concerns or whatnot. But so that's another reason why people are looking at this as an option, because theoretically anybody can mine it rather than just having to go to the areas of the world where there's commercially viable amounts in terrestrial mines.
Hey, Neil, what are your thoughts? So you mentioned, so I know that the ISA is kind of on the side of mining, and Michael Lodge, the head, aren't they getting dividends? Aren't they getting a percentage of what will be mined? And isn't that one of the reasons that they're pro mining? And isn't that a conflict? So are there government bodies that could potentially step in and oversee that?
Yeah, so exactly. It's not that exactly. It's a completely flawed system. That while they're tasked with protecting the marine environment, they actually will make their money off of granting leases, right? Like the leases cost money. Potentially, nobody has actually figured out, because I told you we haven't, the regulations aren't in place. And one part of those regulations is the financial aspects, right? Like how is the profit going to be distributed from something that's considered a common heritage resource? Nobody really knows how that's going to happen, because I mean, just because Nauru and TMC are the first to the table doesn't mean they should just like fully profit for themselves over this thing that is a shared resource. So that's something that people are going to be talking about too. But yeah, it is definitely a conflict of interest, and there's not really like an answer for how that can be mitigated, aside from, you know, member states that are anti deep sea mining and, you know, pro moratorium making this well known on the international stage. I'd say the best way forward is just to continue building support across multiple countries to potentially get enough for a vote that then says like, hey, we now have a 2/3 majority vote for a moratorium. Like that would be what we're hopefully trying to get towards, but I think we're kind of far away from that. So we'll see.
Sweden
Like
just signed on.
Sweden just signed on, Switzerland just signed on. We're expecting a few more actually to make announcements at the ISA, but yeah, I mean, it's still only a handful in comparison to how many member states are in the ISA, right? So definitely a lot more work to be done.
Are there
Yeah.
are there any studies on, because they're going to have to, sorry, I'm going to hog this right now. Are there any studies, because they have to process the nodules and they're doing so possibly in Japan, right? So are there any conflicts or any studies as far as that? Like what will be, you know, because there's circular economy, there's a cost for everything and they're not recycled. There's no, you know, these nodules or anything else can't be, what is it, regenerated, you know, in a quick time scale. So have they done that kind of cost analysis? Do you know if that's been put up?
Like the cost analysis of like how much it would take to process them and like ship them around and things like that.
The full, yeah, just because they're saying one of the things, right? It's like it's we need to get off of fossil fuels. It's less extractive than, you know, kids mining coal in the Congo. But the full life cycle, like, are those, and I haven't read that final report that you put out there, so I'm not sure if, you know, you said
Yeah.
the numbers add up, but has that
Yeah.
kind of analysis been put in?
I'm not gonna say I don't know. I personally, off the top of my head, don't know, can't really like cite any numbers on, you know, whether it makes sense for the cost benefit analysis or not, or like whether it's actually more or less green. So yeah, I don't know, but I think potentially in those two reports that I linked to, they might have some information on sort of the life cycle analyses of those. And I'd say that you're right, that these are going to be processed in different areas. And the metals company, one of the ways that they're doing, they are straight up lying, I'm pretty sure, but they're telling all sorts of different countries. They're like, hey, if like we do this, we'll like process them, like we'll send them to you, we'll send them to India, we'll send them to Japan, we'll send them to, you know, Canada. Like they've
For
literally
sure, they're
said that
doing stuff for
Mexico.
Japan.
They've said that to tons of people. No, I agree, but they're also sort of marketing that to many countries just because they're also vying for more funding, and they're trying to get sort of like multiple support of different states and also trying to get more money. But I mean, I do believe that they would do it in Japan because Japan is pretty pro mining.
And they have one of the oldest like deep sea infrastructures before a lot of other countries. Cool.
Definitely.
Okay. Anybody else have any questions? I'm going to talk to you at some other point because I'd like to get your info.
Awesome.
So go ahead and come off mute. If you have a question, please. Happy to address it. How do we get more people that are anti-mining on the ISA? That's what I want to know, because they hold the purse strings to all this, right?
Yeah, that's what I want to know too. Or like who, yeah. I'm not entirely sure, but it's definitely one of the things that people are talking about and trying to have more transparency inside of the actual like protocols inside the ISA. I think it's possible that, you know, there is progress made in that, and that's definitely something that, you know, coming out for a position on a moratorium is a really big deal for a country. A lot of the countries haven't said anything, right? So like, it's not like the rest of them are pro mining. It's just that they don't want to come out with a position. They're able to be flipped. But things that they have expressed is that they do want more transparency, that they do want better regulations. They haven't said they want a moratorium, but many countries have said we want better regulations in place. We want more science done, and we want more transparency into the ISA. So I think things like that are definitely likely and on the table in terms of how things develop, but I don't know exactly what the straightforward path to that is.
You mentioned small island nations. So like in Kiribati, it's 80 nautical miles from the Clarion-Clipperton Fraction Zone. And there's China's building a new air base on Canton. Do you know if there's been any studies or any research that's been going on there? Because that would be that's kind of one of the first island nations that was approached.
Any research in Kiribati, like Kiribati waters, or no? Or
because they like.
Wait, sorry. Yeah, I mean, yeah. So those small island states, that Hawaii is actually really close to some of the Clarion-Clipperton Zone claim areas, like the Palmyra Atoll. All of those places are very close, and I can't speak to what's being done in Kiribati. I can't remember if actually Kiribati was one of the states that potentially had an early agreement with the metals company or not. You don't think so? But
oh
yeah,
no, they did, but they haven't signed on yet. They had a new government change.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, they were definitely another target of that. But I'm not entirely sure. They're not one of the states that we've been engaging a lot with. Definitely have been engaging with Federated States of Micronesia. Palau has started to engage a lot more. All of these states, just because of their proximity to the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, are a lot more likely to be impacted by it. I'm in Hawaii as well.
Nautical miles. They're 80 nautical miles from one of the extraction sites. Do you know why it's not one of their
why it's not one of their what?
like do you like maybe there's is it like would you know, like is it like a lack of interest or like a lack of access to the entities there?
Oh, why they're not engaging as much? Definitely lack of access, and also prevention of, having it's really difficult to register for the ISA, all these fees. Something that we've worked with the Deep Sea Conservation Coalition on is actually trying to increase the representation of these small island states. So actually like getting funding and funding them and saying like, hey, Palau, like we'll fund for your ambassador to come here. We'll pay for the hotels. We'll pay for the flights. The DSCC has been doing that. Same has been trying to get representation of Vanuatu, who then ended up coming out in support of a moratorium. And so they're definitely, these states have a lot of opinions and their voices make really big waves, but yes, they do struggle to get there, and they're really small populations. They're a lot of, overworked, have a lot more things on their plate than just thinking about deep sea mining. So sometimes we talk to some of the ambassadors and some of the people working there, and it's like, even though it's on their doorstep, there's so many other things that they have to manage and that they have to care about that it really takes a lot of an active relationship building to further have them engage on it. Even in a situation where you're like, this is literally 80 nautical miles away from you, it still takes a lot of effort. And again, because they're developing states and they don't have as strong of an economy as, global north, it's hard to say no until like, they are potentially curious, like, hey, could I make some money off this? Like, could this be good for my economy and for my people? If I do team up with a metals company, like, am I going to get a lot of, significant economic boost out of this? So that's definitely also just part of the dilemma.
So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. Yeah, cool.